Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek. YouTube is full of Antichrist videos these days, identifying current politicians, scientists, people of faith, celebrities, you name it. They're all the Antichrist we've been waiting for. Watch out for these people. The end is here. And in this frenzy and this fervor, it can get muddy and confusing about what the Bible actually has to say about this end times beast. Again, reminding us Antichrist is only a word used by the Apostle John in his letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. It is not used at any time in the book of Revelation. So we're primarily going to call him the beast, as he is called in Revelation, but many people do identify with this name, the Antichrist. As I said, there's many different groups out there pointing to people. For instance, as we look in Judaism, the Jews believe that many of them have found their Messiah. They've identified a specific man. His name's Rabbi Shlomo Yehuda. He's a genuine prodigy with the ability to recite the Torah and other texts by heart. He's been doing this since he was just a child, making him highly esteemed in certain Orthodox circles. Shlomo Yehuda is greatly respected. He's about 34, 35-year-old Jewish man, and reports are even circulating that he has performed 5 miracles, thus setting him apart. Another man sometimes we hear about is Yuval Harari. He is a futurist speaker, and at times he sometimes alarms people when he talks about what the future looks like. For instance, implanting chips in people, and they can be tracked by the satellites in space that will help understand and diagnose health concerns or other problems before they manifest themselves, and how these chips will be able to track people, know where they are, what they're doing. This, of course, screams for some people throughout the world the mark of the beast and has alarmed them to this individual. We go far back. Others, for instance, you can get into some segments that point towards the ancient seer Nostradamus, who wrote a series of predictions around 1547. Some interpretations of his prophecies suggest 3 antichrists, with the 2 already have happened, one being Napoleon, the second being Hitler, and that this 3rd Antichrist remains unknown. Sometimes they point to a name, Mabus, that comes up in some of his quatrains and say that this is the embodiment or the synonym, the name for this 3rd Antichrist. In fact, we ran into during the Persian Gulf War, many were saying, oh, it was Saddam spelled backwards, therefore he must be the future Antichrist, only to find out, of course, that's not true. But Nostradamus, many claim, was a prophet seer who was born in France around 1503. They say that he had stunning prophecies that were extremely accurate. They claim he predicted some very specific events out there. For instance, the assassination of John Kennedy and his brother, World Wars I and II, the French Revolution. Many times they say he had precise dates and names of important figures, that he gave descriptions of airplanes and submarines, details of pilots, for instance, wearing oxygen masks that he called pigmen. All of this was 400 years prior to the events. And I'll show you a couple of his quatrains. I find them, and most scholars do, to be cryptic and very confusing. They can also be non-specific, meaning you can take them to mean all sorts of things, and that has been the problem with Nostradamus. For instance, in Century 2, we mentioned this one earlier. He said, Mabus will soon die, and there will come a dreadful destruction of people and animals. Suddenly vengeance will be revealed, 100 hands, thirst, and hunger when the comet will pass. Again, what comet here are we talking about? Who is this Mabus? When will this happen? Very non-specific. Century number 6, it says his hand finally through the bloody Alis. He will be unable to protect himself by sea. Between 2 rivers, he will fear the military hand. The black and angry one will make him repent of it. Many claim that those point towards the end times and this future world ruler. I find them to be very non-specific and confusing. The Antichrist fervor has been going on for centuries, and many people have been falsely identified and labeled as the Antichrist over time. During the time of the writing, Roman Emperor Nero was a clear candidate. Many say when you added his name up, it came to 666, which we will get to later. He was well known for his persecution of the Christians, even to the point of impaling them and lighting them on fire for his parties. And so he was known to be a particularly cruel and angry emperor, and many identified him as the Antichrist. Even the possibility that he would rise again, there would be another Nero, was what the early church was thinking at the time that John wrote Revelation. Into the Middle Ages, the identity of the Antichrist changed frequently depending on the political climate and who was in charge. Many of the accusations were pointed towards monarchs, the popes for certain, and other leaders during this time. By the end of the Middle Ages, though, and into the Renaissance, clerics and Protestants labeled Antichrist as a tool to call for institutional reform, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church. They used it saying that the church had become corrupt, and they pointed directly at the papacy of the church. And not just the Pope, but the entire Vatican was often labeled as an Antichrist empire in their times. For instance, Martin Luther in 1520, who was a German theologian and a Protestant Reformation leader, he began to believe that the papacy was itself the Antichrist. This made its way through Protestant circles for hundreds of years as an idea of who actually is the Antichrist, and many believe for a long time it's the Roman Catholic Church. The apocalypse was used to justify ideas of manifest destiny, for instance, during the age of discovery and colonialism as countries expanded into the new lands in the world. And apocalyptic literature was integral to Christopher Columbus's outlook and his worldview as well. In 1500, for instance, he proclaimed, "God made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth, of which he spoke in the Apocalypse of St. John, after having spoke of it through the mouth of Isaiah, and he showed it to me where to find it." So he used that as a kind of a driving document to say it's okay what we're doing in the New World to conquer these lands, to conquer these people, and the atrocities that came from that were driven through this apocalyptic literature. Many accused Antichrist often reflect on the social conditions and interests of our times. Like I said, we have the tendency to take whoever the bully is in our time and say, hey, this is the Antichrist. So the Russians had the view that it was Napoleon as he invaded Russia. And this view united the people, and it made Russia look like the rescuer of the world. During the founding of the United States, early colonists cast the Native Americans in this Antichrist role, thus making them the enemy and justifying their behavior of conquering. As the frenzy of the 19th century end times movement took hold, such as with the Millerites, the Catholics once again took a prominent role as the Antichrist figure. The church had become corrupt according to them, and it was during this time period that this Antichrist word truly took hold. Like I said, it's not in Revelation, but it was during the 1800s in particular that that name Antichrist began to take hold in eschatological circles. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was accused of being a pawn of the Antichrist. He was put in the same category as people like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. Each of those was labeled as a possible candidate. Ronald Reagan fell into that category at one point, and many do because if you take his full name, Ronald Wilson Reagan, they said each one is 6 letters, therefore his name is 666, and of course, we know that not to be true now, many years later. Also, we've talked in a previous podcast when the book 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988, which of course was arguing that 40 years after the establishment of Israel as a nation in 1948, that it was taking a verse from Matthew 24, the fig tree, saying that this generation that sees the new fig tree growing will be around for the end, which is a mistranslation of what's going on in that verse. And obviously that did not come true either. In 2012, a Southern Baptist pastor, Robert Jeffries, claimed that a vote for Barack Obama paved the way for the Antichrist. And When they took some polls in 2013, they noted that 1 in 4 Americans believed that Obama might be the Antichrist. And so these ideas during that time began coming out too. We started seeing books about America being the new Babylon, and this is where the Antichrist would come from. These began to appear in bookstores and still are part of the conversation for many people today. But now, of course, new videos are showing up all over YouTube and the internet indicating that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are the Antichrist. And so, in fact, some are like Trump's the Antichrist and Musk's is false prophet, trying to show that they are evil. They're trying to take over the world. And what we also notice is much of this literature, much of this discussion is framing ideas within evangelical Christianity as well. In 2018, a study found that over half of evangelicals believe that Israel needed to exist in the world for the end times to occur. And for this reason, they should be defended politically and economically. Now, whether or not Israel should exist in the end times story and whether or not we should defend them politically and economically are two separate questions, and we need to keep those as two separate questions. But for many, Israel plus a temple is an essential part of fulfilling God's larger plan and story for the end times. So as you can see, I mean, that's just a mouthful. Over the past 2,000 years, there's been a long list of people who have been labeled the Antichrist, and yet time keeps chugging on. And we've been learning more about this beast and what to be looking for. And again, we're given this prophecy for a reason. Jesus wanted us to be ready. He wanted us to be watching and to be prepared. So genuine Christians aren't meant to be caught off guard. We're given enough to know and recognize when the true beast arrives, we will know this person. We will have enough understanding to hold back and to stand our ground. But there was a genuine concern with all the writers of apostasy in the last days, and we'll get to that here in just a minute, that people claiming to be Christians will be deceived like many others in the world when this beast arrives, and that these prophecies exist so that we can hold strong and endure during a time of intense persecution and pressure to leave the faith. All right, let's dive into today's study. Last week, we were introduced to another character in our story who we've already mentioned several times. This one goes by the name the Beast of the Sea. Most end-time circles refer to him simply as the Antichrist. We're most likely going to refer to him primarily as the beast, sometimes using Antichrist, so that you know they are the same thing. With this beast comes a new world empire. There will be a charismatic, powerful leader who we're going to try to learn a little bit more about today. But this empire will have all the characteristics of several other world empires that existed in this region over time and had a direct relationship with the Jewish nation or Israel. That would be the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and Rome. And there's various ideas about there as who this kingdom will be. Some say it's a revitalization of the Roman Empire. They take some verses from Daniel that point to that. And others, though, say it's a continuation of the seventh kingdom. So according to Revelation later, we'll see it describes seven kingdoms. It says one, the sixth, is now, and there will be a seventh later. Many believe that this new empire is a continuation of the seventh kingdom. So we have to ask the question, which kingdom defeated the divided Roman Empire? Well, that candidate is most likely what we call the Islamic Caliphate. It went by other names as well, the Ottoman Empire later, but it was largely known as the Islamic Caliphate. There's always the possibility too, though, others push at that the actual Babylon, not only the empire, but the city will rise again. And we know that modern day Babylon, which is really just a tourist attraction today, is in modern Iraq between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. If God can resurrect Israel, people say, he can certainly restore Babylon. And that's true. God can do whatever he wants. So many focus on the reality that they believe Babylon is going to be an empire again in the future. However, as we are learning and we're studying, we're diving in, the verses around this are cryptic and they can be difficult to decipher, thus the various opinions that we see out there. And we need to be careful at this time about labeling anyone, country, person, or empire as the absolute, this is how it's going to be at the end of times. The Bible did not declare it specifically, it just left us with clues. And we may or may not, this is always hard for some to hear, be as close to the end times as we think. However, this beast comes out of the abyss, is what we are told, and we learned about the abyss in chapter 9, that he and his demonic legions are released to torture unbelieving people for 5 months. They were called locusts, and they were portrayed oftentimes in prophecy in the Old Testament as actual earthly armies. So there's a chance that this is just symbolic language of an earthly army. His name, the leader coming out of the pit, is Abaddon or Apollyon. And the problem is, historically, we know very little about these characters. You have to be careful about what you read out there. Not everything on the internet is true. Historically, we just know very little about these two people. So most people are guessing. The tradition holds that these are fallen angels from the abyss, that they had rebelled, particularly during the pre-flood antediluvian period, and God chained them up in the abyss as punishment to be judged later. So let's continue then in verse 3 where we left off last week. Revelation 13:3. It says, "One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast." Now, from last week, what did we learn? Remember, the beast has 7 heads, it has 10 horns, and 10 crowns. And we talked about this earlier because the question is, if the 7 heads represent 7 sequential kingdoms on earth, that being Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the caliphate, which head has the fatal wound that has to be healed? Well, the Greek here points to the 7th kingdom and how it's written. And this is some kind of head wound or mortal wound. It is not a superficial injury. The physical recovery of the beast increases his fame and his authority throughout the world. People are amazed at this healing and this resurrection of this person. In fact, twice later in verses 12 and 14, we'll see that this recovery is mentioned in connection to the world's worship and devotion to the beast with the false prophet. So some see the beast, however, as a government, not a person. It represents an empire. And in this perspective, the empire has suffered a deadly wound, that the empire will be revived once again as an empire, meaning it once disappeared, but it's returned, and the world will marvel at the return of this empire. However, the most natural way to understand John's words in Revelation 13 make us to believe that while he may be speaking of an empire, and I do think he is, he's also speaking of a man. And we see that throughout history, that oftentimes a person is connected to the kingdom or to the empire. So he says a person, though, will be mortally wounded and then healed. Not necessarily an empire, but it could be both. Now, this is so much a Antichrist sort of thing to do, the name being against Christ, to mimic what Christ has done in a way that points towards the dragon. And so this is one who imitates the death of Jesus and his resurrection. The world will believe him to be supernatural, which is so interesting. They can't believe that Jesus died and was resurrected, but they will believe that about this end times ruler. And this will, of course, add tremendous power and fame to his identity on the world stage. The identical phrase described as the lamb that has been slain was used in Revelation 5:6. So we're given a hint here that essentially this person is going to mimic Jesus Christ. It points directly towards someone being slain and brought back to life. And there's no reason to take this merely as a flesh wound here or that he was healed. The imagery is a slain lamb here. This person received a death blow. And so imagine how such an event would affect those who witness this miracle in our modern times. This person would be seen as divine, like Jesus, and will be worshiped as such. Now, in the Old Testament, there's an interesting prophecy in Zechariah. He speaks of a foolish, worthless shepherd. and he will specialize in consuming the sheep being, of course, Israel in this case, and he is said to exhibit wounds affecting his arm and his right eye. Zechariah 11 says, "Then the Lord said to me, take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd, for I am going to raise up a shepherd over the land who will not care for the lost, or seek the young, or heal the injured, or feed the healthy, but will eat the meat of the choice sheep, tearing off their hooves. Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye." Pay attention to that, his arm and his right eye. "May his arm be completely withered and his right eye totally blinded." Some say that this passage is describing this future beast, this Antichrist, as a bad shepherd, and they point towards the wounds. So, like the resurrected Jesus who retained the holes in his hand and his feet and in his side, so too this revived beast will retain the marks and wounds of his injuries caused in his death. They will be a visible reminder of what he overcame, and they serve to validate his identity as a leader worthy of honor and praise. His wounds and healing result in the global worship of this beast. Let's move on to verse 4. It says, "People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. They also worshipped the beast and asked, 'Who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it?'" And so notice right away that worshiping the beast is giving worship to the dragon. They are linked somehow. And this is what Satan, of course, has always wanted. We mentioned this story a couple podcasts ago, but when you go to Luke 4, Jesus was baptized. He was taken out to the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. Satan would tell him that he'd give Jesus all the empires of the world if he would just bow down and worship Satan. But Jesus refused. What's interesting is in this story, it appears that the beast will bow down to the dragon and will be given the power that he offered. So it's not clear whether people will worship the dragon explicitly and directly, but they are going to worship this future beast. Is the dragon represented by a symbol, for instance, like we saw in fascist Germany in World War II? It is a religion to the people. They see it as such. Or are they just saying that the beast is indwelled or controlled by the dragon, therefore they are combined as one? Could be both, and in this case, we'll have to find out. As people worship this beast and bow down before his government, it may be that they do not know they are bowing down to Satan himself, that Satan is, of course, hiding in the shadows as he always has, but the world will be amazed by the power of this beast, which is given to him by Satan, and believe that he is mighty and he cannot be conquered. Notice it has that idea that this empire can't be stopped. Nobody can confront them. They have supernatural power. Let's keep reading in verses 5 and 6. It says, "The beast has given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and to those who live in heaven." Now, right away, we're reminded of some other descriptions of the beast from the Bible. We go to Daniel 11. It says, "The king will do as he pleases." That's talking of this beast. "He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but he will exalt himself above them all." Boy, the arrogance that you see in that, setting himself above God and condescending God, speaking badly against him. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 says he will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshiped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, specifically here, proclaiming himself to be God. Other translations say that he blasphemes against God, and blasphemer may be a more accurate title than Antichrist in the end. He actively seeks to insult God and his people in public. So this beast, being empowered and indwelt by Satan, shares the same personality as his master. As we've talked about before, when describing the dragon, when describing Satan, He says in his heart, when we look in Isaiah 14, you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. Isaiah continues later on, and some have wondered in this section, is he describing the Antichrist? Is this Abaddon? Is this future, or has this already happened? In Isaiah 14, he says, but you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you. They ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble? The man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home? Now, we will see later then that the worship of the beast will include worship of his image. Some kind of image or statue will be placed in the temple. And once again, notice we see the reoccurring theme of 42 months, which is 3.5 years, 1,260 days. This is the time of Jacob's trouble spoken of in Daniel. Jesus mentions it as well in Matthew 24. We find it in Revelation. The tribulation period, to be clear, is 3.5 years long. Now, he talks about the cry of the world. They say, who is this beast? And what we don't see oftentimes is that this is a mockery, for instance, of the Song of Moses in the Old Testament. When celebrating God's overthrow of their enemies at the Red Sea, Israel sang a song. Exodus 15, it says, who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? This time, people will be asking, who is like this beast? Who can defeat him? Who can conquer him? They will be worshiping the beast directly. John MacArthur had this to say. He says, the Antichrist will be a man, but at some point in his life, he will be indwelt by a powerful demon from the abyss. This demon-possessed man will be a gifted orator, an intellectual genius. He will possess great charm and charisma and have immense leadership power. Added to those natural qualities will be the hellish power of Satan. The result will be a person of superhuman power, vast intelligence, and consummate wickedness. Why? Because he blasphemes God. This is the little horn that Daniel spoke of. In Daniel 7, it says, while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up amongst them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. In verse 11, he says, then I continued to watch because of the boastful words that the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into blazing fire. Verse 20, it says, I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on his head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. And then verse 25, he says, I will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half time. Again, 3.5 years. And so the text designates as many as 4 targets for the blasphemy and rage of this beast. There is God, his temple, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. He will blaspheme all of them. And just before we think, boy, could things get worse, they turn darker as we read verse 7 in Revelation 13. It, the beast, was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And so remember what we learned from the previous chapter. God's holy people are 2 different groups. When we're speaking here, there is Israel, who is the rootstock, and Christians who have been grafted in. We spoke about this in another podcast looking at Romans chapter 11. When we go back 1 chapter in Revelation 12, verse 17, it says, the dragon was enraged at the woman being Israel, and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Well, who are her offspring? It is those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. So we've already talked that there is a remnant that God is going to restore of Israel, that he's going to set apart and save from this time. But then at that point, the beast goes after God's holy people, those who hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. That would be Christians. So what we know from the story is that the beast breaks a peace treaty with Israel. He attacks Jerusalem. As instructed by Jesus, a remnant runs towards the wilderness and the dragon pursues them, but God supernaturally intervenes and protects this remnant. After this, the beast turns his eyes onto Christians. And what we are warned, unfortunately, is during this time, many Christians will turn from the faith. Matthew 24, verse 10, Jesus says, "At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." In 2 Thessalonians 2, it says, "Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by a prophecy or by a word of mouth or by letter, asserting that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs." That's the key there. The rebellion occurs, and the man of lawlessness, who is this beast, this Antichrist, is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. Now, the Greek word for rebellion here is where we get our word apostasy. It's apostasia here. It means falling away. The literal definition of apostasy is the rejection or abandonment of one's religious faith or allegiance, often after a period of professed belief. Therefore, there is a group of people who claim to be Christians who will abandon their faith to protect their lives during this end times tribulation. They are instructed to be willing to lay down their lives, though, for a faith. That's something all Christians must be do. No greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friends. Jesus said, if the world hates me, it's going to hate you. He said, in this world, you will find trouble. That's sort of what Jesus told his early disciples. Be prepared. The world is going to come against you. And he reminds us in Luke 14, he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be their disciple. So Jesus says, sacrifice comes with believing and following me. You have to be willing to lay down your life. And come to find out, people are often bothered by this verse, where it says father and mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters. But we have to struggle with a very difficult question here that many people simply can't struggle with. And what is it? Did you know your family, your children, your spouse can become an idol to God if you allow them to do so? You have to put God even above your marriage, even above your children, even above your family. And that's why people struggle with it. You know, they say blood is thicker than water. They use all those excuses. But family, unfortunately, and tradition can become an idol if you allow them to, or if it distracts you from your undevoted worship of the Heavenly Father. Be careful. We're told later, even by Jesus, that sons will and daughters will turn against their parents, that families will fight families, that in the end they will be betrayed by the ones they love. Matthew 10:33 says, but whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. So we're called to stand and we're called to be bold, even in times of persecution. And during this last 3.5 years, then the beast will begin to pursue and persecute the Jews and Christians. That's why Jesus took 5 verses in Matthew 24 to command and convince the Jews to run, to flee. When they see the sign of the abomination of desolation, run for your lives. And this will somehow be worldwide. Be watching it. It will be televised. Somehow we'll see it. But how will the Christians be punished is an interesting question. And believe it or not, the Bible actually tells us this in Revelation. It's just later on. It says they are beheaded. Notice in Revelation chapter 20, it says, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshiped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or on their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So this beast will speak out against the Most High. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. It says that he will wear down the saints with his persecution. That's all those who refuse to worship his image and refuse to take his mark. And we'll talk more later about this mark, particularly as we discover the false prophet. Daniel says he intends to make alterations in the times and the laws. What he's talking about here is things like calendars, dress codes, food requirements, holidays, prayer. And you can imagine if the caliphate is revived and Sharia law is introduced, there will be changes to the Muslim calendar. There will be a Muslim dress code, Muslim holidays, Muslim prayer will be required. Somehow this beast leader will have authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. It's hard to believe or understand today, but the Bible's very clear about it. And the scriptures say that it's given to him. Well, how long? 3.5 years. The time that's called the Great Tribulation. Mark 13 has to say, those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and will never be equaled again. It's called the time of Jacob's trouble, a time such as never occurred since the beginning of the world till now. Daniel describes it as a time of distress such as never occurred on the nation of Israel. It is a time that shall be cut short, Jesus said in Matthew 24, during which many Jews will be purged, purified, and refined. God will allow the beast 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years to do his worst. Then Christ will return and bring the lawless one to an end by the appearance of his coming. We see that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The true identity will fulfill many Old Testament prophecies concerning what we have talked about many times, the day of the Lord, which will be destruction by fire. It says that at the end, people will be scarce. There will be earthquakes. There will be darkness, signs in the sky. And after this, then Jesus sets up his 1,000-year kingdom on earth. So that's your quick preview of where we are at and where this is going. Now we land on verse 8 in chapter 13. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. That, of course, being Jesus Christ. Now, how do you require all inhabitants of the earth to worship the beast? Well, we'll see later an image of the beast, a statue of sorts, will be placed in the Jewish temple. A mark will be required to buy and sell. And I'm reminded here when I hear this of ancient Rome. Each year you had to go to the temple of the emperor in your town. You had to take a pinch of incense and place it on the altar. And it's located near a statue of the current Caesar. There you would publicly declare in front of everybody, Caesar is Lord. You pay your price, your tax, or your tithe to the priests, and you leave. The problem is a lot of Christians refuse to do this during this time. Rome saw this ritual as an act of allegiance. The early Christians saw it as idol worship, and their only allegiance was to Jesus Christ. So many Christians lost their faith, lost their lives because of this. Is something like this similar to what we will see during this time? What will it look like to bow down and to worship this end times beast? And we have totalitarian regimes today that require worship. North Korea, the Kim dynasty. We have instances where people were standing up and they were clapping for 45 minutes straight, and you couldn't stop. And your excitement had to stay during the whole time as the leader enters the room. If you stop, you're arrested, or possibly worse, you could lose your life. As one person who escaped said, you chant and clap to stay alive. And you see in that country, for instance, the birthdays of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are major national holidays marked with elaborate celebrations and displays of loyalty. Citizens are expected to make oaths of loyalty to the state and to the Kim family at these times, demonstrating their commitment to the ruling ideology. People are expected to bow and show respect when passing their images. Pictures, statues of the Father and the Son are everywhere. And so while I'm not saying that North Korea has anything to do with it, they might at the end times, I'm just saying we have examples today where this worship of a leader is demonstrated. And so you can see how this could go worldwide in the right circumstances. There are many other countries out there that demand the loyalty of their state, much like a religion as well. He does mention in here the book of life. That's not mentioned a lot in Scripture, but it is hinted at. Primarily, it's mentioned here in Revelation. There is an Old Testament mention. For instance, we go to Psalm 69. It says, may they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous. The idea that there are books in heaven, though, is not new. Daniel 7 says, a river of fire was flowing, coming out before them. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 upon 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Exodus 32, Moses says, but now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. We'll see later in Revelation 20, it says, I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, recorded in the books. So we see there are multiple books, at least a book of life, other books outlining what we have done or not done here on earth. And this brings up a lot of theological questions, I realize. But we just want to state, here's what the Bible says, and y'all can wrestle with that within your faith stream. In Revelation, particularly Revelation 3:5, it says, the one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. So regardless of what's in the book of deeds and things done, is always the idea built into Christianity that when you come to Christ and surrender your will and your way to him, your sins are forgotten as far as the east is from the west. You are forgiven. You have been justified, which means justified, never even done it. We are considered not guilty. You are in relationship with Jesus Christ, who is in relationship with the Father. And so you stand before in that book of things that you've done is open. And Jesus says, nope, they're with me. They have been forgiven. And therefore, our name is in the book of life. So to be blotted out, though, of the book of life is to be cut off from God's favor. And so in the New Testament is the record of the righteous who will inherit eternal life. Philippians 4:3 says, yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have been contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. The people whose names are in the book of life will be astonished. In Revelation 17:8 says, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and will go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. And it is from here that things get ominous even more. In verse 9, John says, whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they must be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. So this brings into mind what Jesus told Peter, if you remember, when he cut off a man's ear. It says in Matthew 26:52, he says, put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. This being a warning, of course, that violence only leads to more violence, that violent people will be killed by the sword. This is also a direct quote from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 15:2 says, then the Lord said to me, even if Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, my heart would not go out to this people. Send them away from my presence. Let them go. And if they ask you, where shall we go? Tell them, this is what the Lord says. Those destined for death to death, those for the sword to the sword, those for starvation to starvation, and those for captivity to captivity. John's giving us a clue. He says, go back to that set of verses and understand the context. And what's the context? Well, in this case, Judah is going to be destroyed. God has grown impatient with their insolence and their violence. He's so angry that he wouldn't even listen to Moses and Samuel if they came into his presence to plead for his people. So where are they going? And he just says, some are going to die, some will fight in battle, many will starve, and the rest will go to camps or imprisonment. Judah is under the judgment of God. And here Jesus is revealing with certainty that the people of Israel and Christians are under the judgment of the beast. He will be allowed for a time to come against God's people. This is a call to endure and remain faithful in persecution. And these are indeed evil times. So John leaves us with that final reminder. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Patience because things happen in God's timing. God is still in control, but Christians historically have often had to go through difficult seasons of persecution and will again later. He calls to endurance to hold firmly to what you believe in times of trouble. Are you grounded in the truth of Scripture so that when things get tough and when the deception is great, you can hold firmly to what you believe? Do you have the spiritual disciplines necessary to go through these difficult times? Can you stand firmly on what you believe? And he calls us to faithfulness, which is to remember faith is more than just a head exercise. I often relate it to a three-legged stool. If any one of the legs were to come off, that stool can't stand. They're all equally important. And what are those legs? One is believing, one is trusting, and one is obeying. Ultimately, all resting on a seat that I call allegiance. Who has your loyalty? In the end times, as Christians, your loyalty will be tested. Will you bow down to the beast, or will you continue to endure and worship Jesus? We're going to keep going next week. We're going to be introduced to another new character. It's time to look from the beast from the earth, the false prophet. Looking forward to what we can learn from that. Thanks for allowing me to speak into your life, to talk to you a little bit about these end times, and to be your pastor. It's an honor, a pleasure. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave helpful comments if you'd like to, and thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.